during COVID times when we did Her Power from our living rooms. And
Yes.
It's so nice to be here now in person with you again. Last year, you traveled to Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines with a congressional delegation as part of your work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and with the Senate Armed Services Committee. You were born in Bangkok, but I'm sure that you saw things on that particular trip which really stayed with you. Was there maybe a single encounter that you can recall that stood out?
I think it is the investments that we're making. So in the Philippines, it was my first time back in the Philippines in a long time. And I had some great conversations. In fact, I had a private meeting with President Marcos for over an hour. But the joint investments that are being made all across the Indo-Pacific, but in places like the Philippines, especially with infrastructure, really crystallized because we looked at a major rail project. And there were so many firms there and a lot of American firms as well. So just how thriving the economies are and how people are trying to regrow the economy post-COVID and how much investments other nations are also making in their infrastructure.
Yeah, I believe that railway project was funded in part by the Asian Development Bank. Can you talk a bit about the role of global financing in providing opportunities for women in particular?
So the Asian Development Bank is a great example. Ambassador Chantel Wong has made the commitment that the Asian Development Bank would, by 2030, make sure that 75% of the projects that it sponsors and funds will include inclusivity and access for women. And so making that very firm commitment has been really important. And so you see this starting to take effect right away. For example, after her visit to Singapore, the Singapore Prime Minister came out and declared that they would decriminalize consensual same-sex relationships in Singapore. And so it's not just about women, it's also about LGBTQ issues as well. And in many parts of the world, you're actually seeing a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation being passed by domestic legislatures. And so to have the ADB out there saying, no, we're going to really support and make a preference for projects that provide equal access, and actually promote that access and inclusivity is really important.
Let's move on to the Inflation Reduction Act, which you've described as creating historic change.
Yes.
What opportunities do you think that the IRA provides in particular for women?
So one of the things that I'm seeing as a path to more power, path to more leadership is the entrepreneurial side of things. Women are very entrepreneurial, and I'm seeing this not just in the U.S. but overseas as well. And so through the Inflation Reduction Act, you're seeing investments made all across the country in a way that promotes entrepreneurial organizations. And so you're seeing more women, corporate presidents and women-led firms really having greater access in order to take advantage of the IRA. And I think that's really important.
Famously, you were the first person to vote with a child on the Senate floor. Your daughter joined you in 2018.
Yes.
And you have pushed for legislation to make it easier for mothers to juggle childcare and political duties. I also have to mention that you were the first U.S. Senator to give birth while in office, too. Still in 2024, just a quarter of your peers in Congress are women. So what's standing in the way? And I'm curious how things have changed since you were first elected to the House in 2012. Do you think it's gotten easier, harder?
So I think in some ways things have gotten easier. The problem is we don't have true representation in Washington in either the House or the Senate. The fact is 51% of the senators are not women. If we had true representation, they would be. There are more white men named John in the United States Senate than there are persons of color. Think about that. So, truly, we don't truly have equal representation at the table for folks. And so it is harder, I think, for women to get into elected office. I'll give you an example. On Monday, we had one vote and we were going to have a second vote, which was not anticipated. And my nanny leaves at 7 and the vote is at 5:30. And so everything was set up, and then the leadership added a second vote. And I said, great, the votes usually take, a 15-minute vote in the Senate takes an hour. So, okay, by 6:30, I'll be able to, make it back in time for the nanny. But one of my male colleagues, and this was on a vote that was, we had already won, it was a throwaway vote, and had called in, was on a flight that was delayed and said, I want to vote on this motion to table. And they held the vote open for over an hour and a half. And I said, I'm not going to make it for my nanny.
Sorry, he was on a flight, and he
On a
got
flight.
to say,
Yes.
let's do this.
Okay. So we held the vote open for one person.
Okay.
Was
Was he called John?
No, no. But it was one of these things where it was like, why did we do that on a vote that we had already won, that wasn't consequential, and it was very frustrating. So there's a lot of those types of things that happen. It's why I'm the 10th woman to have a child in office in the House and the first in the Senate. It's because it's not a friendly environment for people with young children. And for my male colleagues who do have young children, their children are back at home with their spouses who are taking care of them. Their children are not with them. Because, I got up this morning, got my daughter dressed for school, made her school lunch, made her breakfast, drove her off, dropped her off before I came in here. None of my male colleagues are doing that. And so the structure is set up in such a way that it is really hard for women to be in elected office, which is why you see many women enter elected office after they've raised their children, right? Speaker Pelosi joined politics after her kids were in high school. Whereas men sort of have this, planned pathway for many of them where they start off as Senate pages, and then they become Senate interns, and then they become a staff assistant, or their uncle or their dad, their grandfather were senators. And so you see a lot of younger men enter the Senate, but women you see, in order to run for office and hold everything together, you find that they often have had to get to a point in their careers where they've raised their children. And that makes things very difficult. And so I think, as a developed nation, as a leader of the free world, it is shameful that we don't have universal paid family leave, that we don't have universal child care, that we don't have, universal Head Start. All of these things need to be put into place so that we take advantage of the productivity of 51% of our population. How do we compete on a global scale economically if 51% of our productivity is being sidelined for the first 20 years of their adulthood? That's crazy.
And you've been consistently focused on kind of highlighting and seeking to rectify these very practical impediments to getting more women involved in public life. I'm thinking, for instance, of the way that now people can find a safe place to breastfeed in airports.
Yes.
Which I don't know about anyone here, but I've personally felt very grateful for that in the past. So thank you for that.
That's one of those things where people go, what keeps you going? I wrote that bill. Because I gave birth in the House in 2014, and I was going back and forth every week between my home in Chicago and DC, and I was breastfeeding, and I couldn't find a place to pump. And they kept saying, and I would ask at National Airport, and I would ask at O'Hare, and they were like, oh, use the handicap stall of the restroom. I'm like, well, that's disgusting. You wouldn't make a sandwich for yourself in there. Why would you think I would pump breast milk for my daughter in there? And then the other option was, well, you could just go plug in next to where those guys are charging their cell phones. If you were sitting next to me in 2015 on a flight, I was pumping. And it was crazy. So we passed that legislation, and it took me getting Republican male doctors to support me to get that passed.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. You are a decorated combat veteran, so I feel a little silly asking this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. People say horrible things to women who are running for office and who are in elected office. And Joe Walsh, who I'm not going to dignify by quoting what he said about you when he was running, but it wasn't very nice. This is in your 2012 congressional race. How can we tell young women in particular, how do we equip them to deal with these kinds of attacks?
I call it out. I mean, I've been in my first race in 06 that I lost, I was called shrill, right? All of the code words on what you say about women, that I responded to something and they said, oh, that response was shrill. My opponent said that, Joe Walsh, the last man that I defeated, also, the last several. But what Emily's List found when they did a study was that people recognize when these misogynistic or racist remarks are being made, and they respect you if you rise above it, but they respect you more and you get them to vote for you. They flip their vote to you if you call it out on the spot. So that's what I tell young women who are running, and I tell all women who are running and persons of color, it's like, call it out on the spot. It's going to happen, but you need to call it out and say that is misogynistic. You would never do a reporting. You would never ask that of a man. You would not say that to a woman. That is misogynistic, and that is not acceptable here. And you say that about racism as well. And so the studies have shown that voters actually change their vote and will support you more if you call it out. They'll respect you, but they may not vote for you if you just rise above it. You have to call it out.
That's great advice. You've done so much to make veterans' lives better, and I did want to spend a minute on this too. Are there particular challenges faced by women in the military, either when they're serving or after they leave, that you'd like people to be more aware of?
So there is a lot of structural stuff that happens that we're still trying to change. And there is the same off-ramp when you get to your mid-career point when you want to raise children. So some of the structural things are, we're still trying to change the military's leave policy. For example, when I first started working on this when I was in the House in 2014, 2015, the maternity leave for women who give birth to children was 6 weeks, including if you had a cesarean, including if your duty station was Afghanistan. So I was talking to a military aide assigned to the House who had just given birth, and she had to go to Afghanistan, and her commander refused to grant her permission to defer and take personal leave time. So 6 weeks after having a cesarean, she had to go to Afghanistan. So we've changed that now, but we're still trying to change structurally that happening. As a pilot, if you get pregnant, that's a grounding condition because they said the uterus can't handle the vibrations from the aircraft. We've changed that now. So the Air Force recently, I think there was an Air Force pilot who was flying when she was up to 7 months pregnant. So we're changing that. So if you get grounded, it means you can't fly, which means you can't really lead your unit. So a lot of women just take that off ramp, right? They get to their mid-career or they choose to defer their pregnancy, which is what I did. And then now you're faced with trying to get pregnant in your 40s and all the infertility struggles that come with that when you finally are the battalion commander. And so the same thing happens there. The other structural problem was that women were not allowed into combat positions. And so to get into the 4-star ranks, one of the things is having been in command of a combatant unit, and women were banned from those units, so they couldn't ever rise to the top the way men could. That's now gone. But those women are just now lieutenants and captains. They're not at a point where, we're going to see a lot more female 4-stars in the next 5 to 10 years as those women rise. So there's a lot of that structural stuff, but then there's just a lot of those sort of off-ramps and things that make it really hard for women. And then there are just the basic biases. I remember showing up at my officer's basic course, and they put a picture up on the wall, on the screen, and said, this is what you should strive to look like. And it was a 6'3" blonde guy with a buzz cut. And this is how you should carry yourself, and this is what you should always look like. This is the ideal military officer, and this is what you should look like. And I'm like, well, I failed on day one. I'm a short Asian girl. I'm never going to look like a 6'3" blonde buzz cut guy. And I raised my hand. I'm like, if that's the ideal, do I need to buzz cut my hair? Well, so there's a lot of those sort of inherent biases that still occur.
Just picking up on that idea of the off-ramps and of women delaying parenting when they're in the military, I imagine you've spoken openly about your IVF journey. Mm-hmm. Is IVF also an issue for access to IVF an issue for women in the military at the moment?
It is an issue, and we're trying to expand coverage because the VA and the DoD did not cover IVF. It is expensive, but it should be covered. And there's a couple things that are happening. One of the things I tell all the young women who come to work for me is freeze your eggs. Like, freeze your eggs. And I'm like overbearing and inappropriate to my female staff members who are in their early 30s. I'm like, freeze your eggs. You're going to want them later. And we need to make that available. This is happening with men too. So there should be, for all military men and women, the ability to freeze egg and sperm, especially prior to a combat tour. The infertility rate among military women is double that of civilian women, and it's rising among men. And The irony is that we did not cover third-party genetic donations, so no donations of sperm or eggs. Up until recently, we were pushing for that to be covered. And the only way we gained ground was when, unfortunately, the men in Afghanistan were on foot patrols and were stepping on landmines and started losing their reproductive organs. And so the only way these male veterans could become fathers was through a sperm donation. And only then did I get my male colleagues to agree to allow third-party donations. When it was just the women needing donated eggs, they wouldn't go for it. But when it's about the guys needing sperm, it's okay. And so among military men and women, this is a big issue. And all of this IVF being made less accessible in states where they have now deemed a fertilized egg as a human being is affecting men in the military as well as women in the military. And people don't realize this is a little bit of a sleeper issue in the military, but it is very much an important issue. So you're seeing a lot more military men and women starting to, on their own, freeze their egg and sperm before they go on a deployment.
Senator, I think we could keep talking forever, and I love the life lessons that you've imparted to us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
You are good. Right on the dime. Thank you.
Next, please welcome to the stage Data 2X Executive Director, Krista Jones-Batista, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Senior Program Officer, Jennifer Hansel, Chief of the UN Women's Research and Data Section, Papa Sack,